Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and I want to start with a little bit of a celebration. Today marks 1 year since Mark and I recorded our very first episode, which...
I did not know that.
Yes!
That's great.
Yes, and I have it in our show prep, and we talked about it, that we've been podcasting for a year now this month, which is really exciting. And so I just wanted to thank all of our listeners for subscribing, for all of the likes, and for tuning in each week. Mark and I have absolutely loved doing this podcast. And, well, I gotta say, I don't know how motivated we would be if people weren't listening.
I think the motivation would not be very high, Liz.
Yeah. But we do have listeners, and we are so incredibly thankful to you guys for coming on this journey with us. We have loved doing it. We have loved your feedback. We have loved your emails, and we hope that you will continue with us as we keep coming up with topics of mental health and trying to destigmatize the mental health problems that are in this world. So I think that a good topic to start our next year podcasting in is empathy. And honestly, I'm a little surprised that it's taken us an entire year to get to this topic, because it's kind of a big one in mental health.
It is a big one, but I think we've mentioned it
A lot.
through various episodes. Like I remember in the communication episode between couples that talked about it. So we've kind of maybe skirted around it, but now we're going to go right into it.
Yeah, and delve right into empathy and really kind of break it down from a mental health standpoint. So let's start with the difference between sympathy and empathy, because they're very, very similar, but there is a difference. So why don't we start with your thoughts on that? What's the difference between sympathy and empathy?
And it's a good question. And when I talk with couples, because this always comes up when we're talking about communication with couples, and I will ask them, what is your definition of empathy? Because I want to know what they're thinking about. I'm pretty surprised that most individuals really know the difference between empathy and sympathy, or at least they are able to realize that empathy is all about emotion. It's about being able to put yourself in the other person's emotional space to really understand, like, for instance, if the person is experiencing grief, how that might be for them, as opposed to sympathy, which is just, I'm sorry that this happened to you. It's more of a regret that you're experiencing it, whereas empathy is closer to, I really understand how you feel.
Right. And my understanding has always been sympathy is like, oh man, I'm sorry. Whereas empathy is, I get it. I understand.
I get it. Yeah. That's a good way to describe it. But it's really about emotions. Empathy is about the other person's emotional experience. Whereas sympathy could be, I suppose there's emotion in it, but I'm sorry you lost that $1,000 in that terrible investment you made. That's sympathy. Whereas empathy would be, man, you must be really worried and concerned about the loss of that money. It's a very different approach, I think, to the same issue.
In order to really feel empathy, you have to have some sort of emotional connection to this person.
I don't know that I agree with that. I think it's easier.
Okay.
Because if you take the therapeutic relationship, then I think that you can train yourself to be more open to others' emotional experience. In a bit, I think you asked the question on the outline about empaths, and we'll get more into that, with people who are self-described as empaths. And I think it's just, how open are you to another person's emotional experience? So I don't know that you need necessarily the connection. It makes it easier, though.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
I can see that. I mean, because I guess I'm thinking, I've had random conversations with strangers before, and they've happened to tell me something that's unfortunate. I'm like, oh man, that's too bad, or that's unfortunate. But I don't feel like that deep, like that deep desire to help them as much as I would compared to when Curtis is telling me about a problem that he's having, or a close friend or a family member. I mean, I definitely feel more of a deep connection. I want to help you. So maybe that's kind of where I was getting at, is your emotional connection to someone has a big play on empathy.
Right. And also the context. So if you think about,
Yes.
say, the therapeutic context, I mean, really, that's the main job of a therapist, I think,
Yeah.
is to, so I can have a new client walk into the office and they'll sit down and, we'll spend an hour together that first time. So I don't really know them, but they can tell me their story.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on what the story is, I can have a lot of empathy for it. And part of that is one, it's my role. But the second part is I've heard a lot of people's similar stories over the years. And so once you experience, someone who has experienced that, it becomes easier to say, oh, okay, I get it. I get it.
Okay.
What it is you're going through. So I think a lot of it certainly is about context. And so if you meet someone on the street and they start telling you about, whatever it is going on, then you aren't going to have the same empathy. I had an experience that reminds me of this. So years ago, I was on vacation. We were in Palm Desert and I went and got a haircut. And often the person cutting the hair says, well, what do you do for work? And I said, well, I'm a psychologist. And in that moment, this person started telling me, I honestly can't remember. I think it was about a failed relationship. So normally I would have been more empathetic.
Uh-huh.
But in that context, I listened and I understood, but it wasn't like I was feeling a lot of empathy.
You were there for a haircut.
I was there for the haircut. But so here's the interesting thing. This is the end of the story, is that this person got so involved in telling me, and I'm here I am pointing to my beard, listeners, I have a beard, and she had cut part of my beard off.
Oh, no.
I'm just on one side because she got so involved in telling me this story. And so actually I was kind of miffed at the end.
I would be too. Yeah.
And so my empathy did not come out in that particular situation, even though I'd heard many similar stories from others.
Yeah. So empathy, we know, is a learned emotion. Kids are actually born without the ability to feel empathy.
Well, I think we all have the ability to feel, because there are actually, when we talk about empaths, and the opposite of an empath would be, say, a narcissist or a sociopath, there are actually brain differences. You remember in several of the last episodes, we've been talking about nature versus nurture, and that most things are a combination of the two.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying has some truth in it, but you couldn't do it unless the brain was set up to do it.
True.
And so I agree with you. You have to have that brain structure. And, we'll go into this later on, that some people are born with a different brain structure, the sociopaths, the narcissists, the psychopaths. So it doesn't matter what the nurture looks like, because they don't have the nature part of it, and they don't have the ability to make the connections. So actually, you're right. I just wanted to make sure listeners understood about the brain structure, that is important.
Yes.
But we teach our children empathy. You're right about that.
I have days where I've wondered who's more narcissistic today, my 5-year-old, my 2-year-old, or my cat.
That's their task, is to be narcissistic with.
Oh, yeah. Kids are hard. And part of why they're hard is because, especially toddlers, is they really don't care about what's going on in your life, or they don't have the ability. Earlier today, I'm sitting here and I'm reading a book with my 9-year-old, and my 2-year-old comes up to me and he just starts piling all these toys in my lap and saying, upstairs, upstairs. Like right then, didn't matter that I was doing something. He wanted me to drop everything for him and go take him upstairs for him. But again, our job as parents is to teach our kids to understand empathy and to try to help them understand what other people feel and what other people need and want.
Right. Because otherwise they don't learn what that is. And so, John Gottman, who is he's well known for his marriage work, But I don't know how many years ago, he got to a point where he was trying to figure out what's going on in the families. And he and his wife got interested in children.
Mm-hmm.
And so he over time, he developed this idea. He calls it the heart of parenting or emotion coaching. For some
Mm-hmm.
reason, he has the two titles. And so if you were to go to his website and look under parenting resources, you would see one of those, either emotion coaching or the heart of parenting. So he really believes that emotion coaching is what parents do to help their kids, one, learn how to verbalize or label the emotions, because that's where it starts,
Yes.
empathy, because you have to be able to understand what's going on inside of you
Mm-hmm.
before you can then eventually say, oh, this is what's going on with that person as well. So the first step to teaching empathy is to help your children understand their own emotional state. And so simply put, emotion coaching is the ability or the focus of parents to notice what's going on. First of all, I notice you that you are sad, and then to throw it out and label it. It looks like you're sad. And the child, often as they get older, they might say, no, I'm not really sad, I'm this. And if they do that, that is an incredibly good sign,
Yeah.
because they're saying, oh, okay, no, it's not that, it's something else. So it's okay for parents to throw out a label that may be inaccurate, because if it is, the child will often correct them. But that's the way we learn. That's the way the children learn. And so
Exactly.
if you once you label it, then you can talk about, then you show them that empathy,
Mm-hmm.
because hopefully you understand what it is to be sad and how hard that is to be sad, or to be angry, to verbalize the anger. But then once the child knows that you get it, so it goes back to what you said about empathy. It's, I get you, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to I'm sorry for what you're going through. And so once the child knows that their parent gets them, then you can talk about, okay, what are the options as far as what you can do with this? Like as far as anger, what do you
Mm-hmm.
do with anger? And so you're teaching children how to be aware of the emotion and what you do with the emotion.
Yes, those are very important. So I had a really good opportunity to put some of my therapy skills I've used from podcasting to work with my 9-year-old. So she's got this big test coming up, and I brought it up to her, and immediately her face changed to this look of just pure panic. I immediately could see what was going on, and I said, okay, so tell me what you're feeling. So she said, well, I'm really scared, I'm really anxious, I'm really nervous. And I tried to probe deeper. Okay, so tell me why. What about it makes you nervous? What are you nervous about this test? And she just kept saying, I'm just so nervous, I'm just so nervous, and I'm stressed. And so I said, okay, let's talk about why you're feeling this emotion. And I talked about why we feel anxiety. And when we feel anxiety or when we feel emotions, it's our body's way of telling us to do something. So you are
Mhm.
feeling anxious and stressed about this test. So let's prepare for it. Let's do some
Yeah.
extra work. Let's do some stuff to prepare, and that will help you to feel better about this test. And it totally worked. And she's feeling much better about it now. And I reached out to her teacher and I let her know about this conversation. I said, hey, is there some extra work that we could do at home? And, it was a really good learning experience. And it was a parenting win in my book.
Yeah, it is, because you did the right things as far one, you noticed. See, a lot of parents don't notice. And even if they notice, they may not say anything because they don't know how to approach it. And
Yeah.
so, two really important steps: I notice you,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm interested in you. So, I want to know what's going on in your world. And
Yes.
then, certainly with anxiety, you're absolutely right about anxiety, that you never get rid of anxiety, and all our emotions
Mm-hmm.
tell us something, and anxiety is saying, okay, prepare. Because if you had no anxiety about the test, you wouldn't prepare, and then you'd
Yep.
fail.
Yeah.
So it's really good information. I mean, that is a parenting win. And it's a really good example of how you can, because you've probably experienced it at some point in your educational career,
Oh,
some
yeah.
sort of anxiety around taking tests. So see, as a parent,
Mhm.
oh, we get that. I get that. Yeah, I've experienced that.
And that's exactly what I told her. It's like, I get anxiety from tests too. And so I was able to explain that to her. And one of the things that I tell my kids all the time is it's okay to feel what you're feeling. And
That's right.
and it's okay that you're angry. You can feel this anger and you can be as angry as you want. I had another good experience with this same daughter a couple of days ago where she would get really mad and she said, "Okay, so this is what I do to get my mad out." And she listed these things that she did. And I listened to them and I said, "Okay, I love that you're trying to handle and deal with your emotion." And one of the things she said is, she said, "I scream really, really loud and then I get destructive." And I said, yes.
What did he destroy?
She,
Great.
so when she gets angry, she wants to like knock things over and throw things on the floor. And I said, okay. And the other thing she said is, I stomp my foot. And I said, okay, so I like the ideas that you have, and stomping the foot, that's okay. I can live with that. But screaming, that's very disruptive to everyone. So screaming is not okay. And being destructive, that's also absolutely not okay. Those behaviors are not. So what are some other things you can do to get your mad out? And she's like, well, I could scream into a pillow. And I'm like, sure, that works for me. I'm okay with that. You're not disturbing the entire house with your screaming. And she's like, well, maybe I could just like move chairs around or move some of the furniture when I need to get my mad out. And I said, okay, that works. If you need to, move a toy, or if you need to push a chair a few inches one way, that works for me. And it was another really good teaching moment for my child.
So this is a bit of extra information. Years ago, it used to be thought in the therapeutic circles that actually, like if you were angry, some therapists would suggest, well, you go to DI and you buy all the old plates for $0.25 each, and then you take them somewhere and smash them, so that destruction that it was thought would be helpful. But the research is pretty clear that it's not. Okay. That what happens is that it ramps you up.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't do any, people think, well, I'm discharging the anger, I'm getting it out. It actually ramps it up and makes it more intense. And so, your inclination to say, well, let's not break things, that's a good one, because it's more about feeling and understanding the emotion, expressing it, and then calming yourself down.
Yeah, self-regulation.
And that doesn't, self-regulation. That doesn't negate the importance of the anger or that something made you angry. Mm-hmm. It's more about the realization of what's going on that made me angry. And then what are some, practical steps that I can take to change whatever the situation is. But you're absolutely right. It's about self-regulation.
Yeah. And I also wanted to make sure that I didn't just completely quash her ideas, or rather quell the emotion, because that's another mistake that I think parents make in teaching their kids empathy is they often say, just stop it, or they just say, knock it off, and they try to repress the emotions. They say, well, just stop being so angry. And well, you don't want to do that. You don't want to just cast the emotion aside. I mean, you need to validate it, and you need to let them know that you see their anger, you see their emotion, this big emotion that they're feeling, and don't try to repress it. Just help them through it. That's incredibly helpful for kids, and it's going to be great at teaching them how to later on down the road care for others. It's going to help them to have better relationships. It's going to help them develop good relationships with peers. And I think with my oldest, I know we've definitely helped cultivate that with her, because she has excellent relationships with peers.
And that ties into something I wanted to say. Why empathy? Why do we care?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And it's about connections.
Yes.
It's about being able to build connections. We are a species who really wants to be connected, whether it's, within the family or peers or, whatever it is, even in, say, adults for the business setting. It's important to be able to have, those types of connections. And that's what empathy does. It allows us to build connections. And I think that one of the major issues with our culture, and I don't know what it's like, say, in other cultures, I'm really just talking about the culture here in the United States, is that there is an incredible lack of empathy.
Yes.
And empathy, I think a lot is about being able to listen to other people's positions and not be threatened by it.
Mhm.
And I think it must be fear. There's so much fear about difference
Yes.
that often we don't take the time to listen to someone who has a different idea. It doesn't mean you have to believe what they do. It's just the empathy is about the connection. You and I have very different ideas about a lot of things. I mean, certainly our
Yes.
political differences are very strong, but it doesn't mean that we can't listen to each other
Mhm.
and understand where each other is coming from. Because I have no desire to change what you think, and I've
Yep.
never felt like you wanted to change me. It's just
Nope.
about understanding,
Mhm.
and it's the acceptance of we're two different people and we think about things in a different way. And so I think empathy is really important. I work with couples a lot to have empathy for each other because it's not surprising that when they come in and they're struggling, there's an incredible lack of empathy going on
Mhm.
in the relationship. And I really believe that the solution to this culturally is to start within the family. And within the family, you start with the couple. And that the couple, if they can cultivate that empathy between them, then you pass that on to your children. And if we could get families to start being more empathetic with each other,
Mhm.
then I think that it tends to generalize, like you just mentioned about your daughter. Then she goes out into the school world and she's learning to have empathy for others, and that she'll run into children who are different than she is, and that's okay because it's not threatening and she can understand their position. So I think it's empathy, in my mind, is the solution to a lot of cultural issues.
And I completely agree. One thing that drives me absolutely bonkers on social media is how often people will say, I've unfriended this person because of what they believe. I'm like, that is so
It's
toxic.
the
And
opposite. It's the opposite of empathy.
yes, and I have a few people in my news feed that I purposely interact with their posts more and pay more attention to their posts because they believe almost the complete opposite of me. And I
Mhm.
want to know what they're thinking. I can't imagine ever saying, "Oh, I mean, it'd be kind of like saying, "Oh, you're not the same religion as I am. No, we can't be friends."
Well, and there are many people who do that.
Which, I mean, is, first of all, that's kind of the complete opposite of religion.
Yes, that's true.
I, I mean, at
But
least
people don't
most
realize
religions.
that.
Yeah, but and like you said earlier, Mark, you and I disagree, and I think our things that we disagree with most widely are politics and
Mhm.
religion. And those
Mhm.
are
Yeah.
those are big ones. Those are important ones. But, at the end of the day, we can talk about it and we can listen to one another. This brings up an example I've given. Oh, it's been several episodes ago, but my best friend from college, we were roommates in college and we've just stayed really close over the last decade. And we started getting into politics around the time that the pandemic started. So it was about 2 years ago. And it turns out we're on complete opposite ends of the political spectrum. I mean, we believe very, very differently. And you know what? It's fine. I mean, we can still talk, we can still be good friends, and we can listen to one another because we have mutual respect. And at the end of the day, our friendship is much more important than, our political beliefs. And I mean, there's so much toxicity in this world, and especially politically. I mean, our country is so politically divided, and empathy is what is missing.
Right. And so I think, just to take the example of you and I a little bit further, I think what makes it work for us is we have commonalities in
Yes.
how we see the importance of family and relationships.
Yes.
And we're completely on the same page about all of those things.
Mhm.
And so, it might be the same with your friend. I mean, you have these commonalities that are there, and so that makes it work. But I think it's true for us as a people. I truly believe we have more in common
Yes.
as a people than we have differences,
Yeah.
and that somehow the differences have been just blown up so that
Mhm.
they're so much more important. We somehow ignore or forget all the things that we do have that are the
If
same.
if someone wants a really good exercise in empathy, what they need to do is they need to find someone who they know disagrees with them and say, I just want to hear your thoughts on this. I don't want to try to sway you. I don't want to get into an argument. I just want to hear what you think. And then genuinely keep your mouth shut and listen.
Right. So there are, I mean, that's one of the things I wanted to bring up is, so what if you're an adult? Because I run into adults who, were raised in such a way that they don't have a lot of empathy. And so
Mm-hmm.
we're always going, okay, how do you get empathy then? And I think that one thing I've mentioned before is increase your vocabulary as it relates to emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Because in order to think about someone else's emotions, as we said, you've got to be in touch with your own, and you have to have a vocabulary that's able to describe it. But there are actually some steps that you can take that are helpful. And one is to read fiction. Now,
Okay.
and here's the reason why. Because if we're interacting with someone like
Mm-hmm.
you and I don't know what your internal process is,
Mm-hmm.
right? I can make a guess, and there's all this stuff going on inside you right now.
Mm-hmm.
In a book, however, you often know what the internal process is of
Okay.
the people that you're reading about. And that turns out to be pretty helpful in, learning how to be more empathetic. The second one is just what you said, is listen. I don't know, it's surprising to me how many people do not listen well. And
Mm-hmm.
I see it in the context of couples, certainly, that they just don't listen to each other. And honestly, I don't get it. And so if you take the time to say, I just want to listen to you. And I think your idea about finding someone, who maybe has a different idea about something and just listen.
Mm-hmm.
But then the third step would be to actually practice empathy and say, okay, I'm really going to try
Mm-hmm.
after listening to put myself in your emotional space.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes practice to do that.
Yes.
I really believe that people can learn to do it, though.
Yeah.
I think it's there. I think that most of us, the percentage of people who really have the ability to have empathy, it's very high. It's like 97, 98%, because,
Mm-hmm.
those narcissists and sociopaths and psychopaths actually have brain differences, which I can just mention. There are reduced connections between different parts of the brain where those emotions are, where we feel the emotions and can sense them. So there actually are structural differences. But for the vast majority of us, that is not the case. And it's all about how we're raised
Mm-hmm.
or the efforts we put into really trying to understand other people from that empathetic standpoint.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I don't know that we can talk about empathy without talking at least briefly about what's going on over between Russia and Ukraine. And not that we need to go into the politics of it, but man, have I been feeling a lot of empathy for the people of Ukraine. And there's been times where I've had to close myself off from it for a minute because
Mhm.
I'm overwhelmed. And then, when I come back to it, I think, boy, I bet those people in Ukraine sure wish that they could take a break from it, that they could, turn it off, and they can't. And so, I think part of being human is to try to put ourselves in the situation of another and to try to be
But,
empathetic.
but I think it's also, I think, appropriate to talk about Putin for a minute, because
Hmm.
if you think about it, he's a dictator. I mean, he's an elected president, but he's pretty much a dictator.
Yeah.
You'd have to be in that category of sociopath or psychopath to be able to do that and not care
Yeah.
about death. And just, he hasn't been attacked, and I actually don't understand the rationale behind his invasion. It seems like it was created, but
Hmm.
in his mind, there's certainly no empathy. I mean, if there were empathy, he wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
And so, that he's one of those people who is in the 2%. And there's probably something very different with his brain.
I think there must be because, no one does. You have leaders all across the world that are saying, hello, what are you doing? And so, on the one hand, I feel incredibly sorry for him and his lack of ability to feel empathy because, feeling empathy myself has brought me such deep emotional connections with people, and it's enriched my life. When it
Mhm.
comes down to it, is my ability to feel empathy. And sometimes I wonder if my empathy goes a little too far, and maybe this leads us into the topic of can you be an empath? And I've talked about this before. My struggle with watching TV or movies, I put myself into the emotional space of
Hmm.
that person.
Sometimes when I'm watching, I have to turn a show off.
Yeah.
I can't
Yeah.
take it anymore. I just turn it off. I don't know if you ever do that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's been movies that I can't watch. So there's this docu series. I think it's a dramatized docu series, but it's based on what happened in Chernobyl
Uh-huh.
back in the 80s, and I couldn't watch it. They did a really good job of adequately depicting what happened and the devastation, and it was too much for me because I thought those children, those women, oh, it was too heavy, and I couldn't take it.
There was a show, this was years ago. I still remember this. Lindy and I were in a theater watching a show called The Elephant Man,
Okay.
which is based on a true story of a man who had some sort of genetic disease. It was so hard to watch because of the way people were so cruel to this
Mm.
man. It was just awful. Anyway, empaths. So I don't know why I think her name was Deanna Troy. Isn't she the
Okay.
empath in Star Trek?
I don't know. I don't know Star Trek.
You know, I think, there are probably Star Trek people out there who will know that Deanna Troy is the
Oh,
empath.
I'm sure there are. Yeah.
So it depends on how you define empath. And
Mhm.
so, one definition is that I think you absorb the emotion, or like we're talking about movies, and even the people in the movie, it's like you absorb the world's joys and stresses like an emotional sponge. Do you ever feel like
Mm.
an emotional sponge? Like you do? And I've had people actually describe it that way to me.
Yes and no. I think maybe either I'm just so used to it because I've done it my entire life, or I'm good enough at compartmentalizing. And I have, for many people in my family, or people in my family have in the past come to me with big problems they're having, and I talk them through it, and and I've helped them out before, and I love to do it, and I'm happy to do it, but and maybe it's because we don't live in the same state, but I'm able to compartmentalize enough that it doesn't completely drag me down. But I mean, I get what you're saying, that I do feel like emotional sponge. I guess I'm just good at finding my own happiness even when I am being empathetic with other people. And that's, I think, is important, because if you are overly empathetic and you get too involved into someone else's emotions, you are not going to be a happy person.
Right. Let me give you a different way to think of it. I think we have filters
Mhm.
that protect us in some way from taking in too much. And
Mhm.
I often get this question about my job. How do you do that? How do you sit all day and listen to people talk about it? In the moment with them, I can, and sometimes I move to tears by the stories. I mean, and I don't see that as a bad thing at all because it's a genuine response. But at the end of the day, the filter I have in place is it's their life, it's not my life, and I go home to my life.
Yeah.
And so we all have filters that protect us in some way from taking too much in as far as that empathy and other people's emotional issues. And so I think an empath, you could describe that as a person who doesn't have very good filters, or they don't have
Okay.
that same ability to block it out. And honestly, I don't know if that's a learned thing. Well, I suspect it's probably a combination of nature and nurture, because most things
Yeah.
are. But I think that there's some learned aspect to being able to create the filter,
Mhm.
which then protects you. So, are there empaths? Yes. If the definition is that you don't have very good filters to keep all of this out, and you are fully absorbed by it, that's probably not a healthy thing.
Yeah, and I like what you said about, at the end of the day, they go home to their life and I can empathize with them and I can feel their sorrow. But I go home to mine.
Yeah.
And I think, part of being, I guess, maybe a good empath is you have to have good happiness, or you have to be able to find happiness in your own life. Because if you can have joy, and if you can, once you get out of that situation where you're being really empathetic with someone, if you can then go to a situation where you can feel happy. I mean, because I think of when I'm helping a family member through something that they're really struggling with, I often will go talk to Curtis about it, and I'll explain to him, oh, this is what, my family member is going through. and we can talk about it, but I go to a source of joy right afterwards because my marriage brings me incredible joy. And so I think if you feel like you are an empath, or if maybe you feel you have a child who is an empath, help them to find the joy after the empathy, I guess is a good
And I think that I've certainly known good therapists who don't have very good filters, and they are consumed by the empathy they feel for some of their clients. And that is not a healthy place to be.
Yeah. All right. So this has been a fantastic episode, and I hope you guys enjoy it as much as we have. Next week, we are going to get into a book by John Gottman, and it's called John Gottman's 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work.
I think it's his first book, and it's a classic one, and it's really a great book for couples. So we'll probably start a couple of different episodes going over those 7 principles.
Yeah, because we have an inability to talk briefly on subjects.
Well, we actually have a great ability to go off on the tangent. So, we won't try and do them all in one episode.
No. So, but it's going to be good because as our longtime listeners know, Mark and I love talking about relationships and marriages. So we will see you all next week.
Have a good week.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.